Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Trevor Moffat from the Improvement Service, and I'm joined here today by Emily Taylor and Kenny Taylor as well, from the Crichton Carbon Centre and NatureScot for today's presentation on peatland action and peatland restoration. Our audience today is predominantly planning staff, local authorities, but I'm aware there's a few other staff here as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see huge numbers on the call today. Obviously, quite a lot of interest in this topic, so that's grand. So yeah, my name is Kenny Taylor. I'm a member of the Supporting Good Development team within NatureScot. I've been involved in peatland aspects throughout my time with NatureScot. I've got a background in renewable energy development, so I've been helping develop all sorts of guidance related to good practice construction, peat survey work throughout my time for giving advice to developers. I think it's important to bear in mind today we'll learn a lot about peatland action, the peatland action process, the funding mechanisms, etc., and peatland restoration, and particularly you'll hold that in your understanding of how the new permitted development rights will work for peatland restoration. So I was involved in some of those discussions there between the Scottish Government Planning team and ourselves in developing the guidance and the permitted development rights for peatland restoration. I'm sure there'll be questions on that later on. But I think where it's important to learn today and to take away from today that a lot of what you'll pick up in this training is applicable to all sorts of developments relating to peat. So renewables in particular, especially wind farm sites, offshore wind farm sites, but all sorts of aspects to do with the infrastructure related to that grid and tracks in particular, but also housing applications as well. We're dealing with some research up in the Lochaber area, for instance. There's quite a lot of call for new housing, and there's a lot of peatland up there, so there's some research going into issues there. So it's important to bear in mind that yes, this is very much to do with gaining a bit of confidence and capacity in our knowledge in peatland action related to permitted development rights, but it is applicable to a host of other proposals, casework and planning related matters and where it sits. Obviously, we're waiting for some definitive lines to come out of the National Planning Framework over the next couple of months on peatland and peatland protection related to casework. But essentially what we're going to learn today is the fundamentals of how sensitive these habitats are, how you go about protecting them, and some of the ways that NatureScot and wider external stakeholders can help in that process, including yourself. So with no further ado, and without me ranting on, I'll hand over to Emily to outline today's learning and the sort of issues she'll cover. Thanks, Emily.
Great, thank you very much, Kenny. I'll keep my face on screen just now, just to say hello to you all before I start sharing my slides. But yeah, I'm Emily Taylor. I'm actually based at the Crichton Carbon Centre. And we have been working as part of the Peatland Action team with NatureScot now pretty much since its inception. Our role as Crichton Carbon Centre is to act as project officer, so we're very much at the coalface of peatland restoration design and delivery. We've worked on a number of projects now across the southwest of Scotland. My other hat as well with NatureScot and Peatland Action is training. So I've been running training courses for a range of different audiences for about 4 years now. We're busy trying to talk about the practicalities with contractors all the way through up to the likes of yourself. So thank you very much for logging on today. As Kenny said, really today I'm here as the kind of Peatland Action Project Officer perspective. I'll talk you through the sort of Peatland Action application process, how we go about designing peatland restoration projects, some of the checks and balances as part of that design process. But I'm also just going to talk about the fundamentals of peatlands ecology, hydrology, and the restoration that we're doing. So when you hear some terminology being thrown about, you understand what that means in the real world. So today is a very practical take on peatland restoration, and I hope it will be useful for the kind of range of peatland projects you may well get involved in. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to share my screen now successfully. So just bear with me. I don't think that is working, Trevor.
Let me just sort out, a few people have mentioned there's some sound issues as well. I'm just trying to sort that out too. So if you try to bring up your slides now, Emily, that should be you.
Yeah, that seems okay.
Yeah.
How's my sound?
Your sound is fine to me. If anyone else in the room can let us know if they're having any sound issues, I can check, but it's sounding okay to me now, and your slides are up and showing, so I'll just pass back to you to go through the agenda for today.
Great, thank you very much. Right, so here's our agenda for today. It's a lot to squeeze in, but you will get a break around 3:30 for 20 minutes. Because we've got so many people on the call, we're going to try and keep questions very much to the chat box. As was explained at the beginning there, you should see a little pop out on your screen that you can put any questions in. And we'll have got time for some open discussion at the end, and we'll go through some of the questions, perhaps some of the questions that the stronger themes that are coming through. However, if there are questions that we can't answer today, either because we don't have the sort of expertise, there's a huge team in Peatland Action, so there's plenty of people I can draw on, but we will get back to you if there's any particular queries that you have. Now, most of my slides are quite sort of image heavy, but there's some with a lot of text on. Please don't worry about noting down all the text. If need be, I can pass on a copy of all the really text heavy slides, so don't worry about scribbling notes. Hopefully you'll see lots of information and lots of images that will help illustrate what I'm talking about. Okay, so firstly, a little bit about Peatland Action itself. So Peatland Action is the national programme for peatland restoration in Scotland. It's administered by NatureScot. It's an incredible project. It involves multiple different partners, the Crichton Carbon Centre being one, but we have everybody from the Shetland Isles all the way down to south of Scotland involved in Peatland Action, and a really strong team in NatureScot as well. Everything from project officers like ourselves right the way through to kind of grants managers and everybody else in between. So it's a big team behind this. And it is incredible what we've achieved. So far, way over now the 25,000 hectare mark in terms of the restoration area that we've worked on in the project. So, you know, there's been an exponential increase in peatland restoration in Scotland. And it is a fairly new industry, if you like. We've seen a lot of restoration, a lot of capital expenditure in the likes of the Northern England for a long time. But really, the Peatland Action Project has really picked up pace in Scotland now, and we are really delivering at scale. And yeah, we're very, very busy year on year. Now, the key thing for you to understand is that it's not just a NatureScot project. There are many different people involved, and there's lots of different external organisations as well where project officers are hosted. You'll hopefully get to know who your local project officer is, which is helpful for you, but there's a general inquiries email address. If you ever want to get in touch with anybody at Peatland Action, you go to that general inquiries email address, which you can get from just Googling Peatland Action NatureScot, but we'll make sure there's a pack of this kind of information and links to these sorts of contacts as well that will be passed around after today's session. Okay, so this is just a wee map that shows the distribution of project officers in the kind of regions in which we work. So it was very obvious in the early days that you could tell where your project officers lived, because that's where the cluster of restoration projects were happening. So definitely your project officers are key. They were key facilitators. We've really driven a lot of the on-the-ground work. And we now have projects right across from the Shetland Isles down to south and down to Hebrides as well. So we've got really, really good regional coverage. A key thing to really talk about is carbon. We'll touch on the drivers for peatland restoration, but again, this is some simple terminology around carbon that will be useful for you to know and understand. And because carbon, I think, initially was certainly the big driver for peatland restoration and the big driver for certainly the levels of investment we're getting from Scottish Government. And you'll hear these 4 terms really commonly. So they're really simple. We're basically describing different conditions of a peatland. We've got our actively eroding, where you've got lots of bare peat, where we're losing peat to the atmosphere, carbon to the atmosphere. We've got our drain sites as well. A lot of our peatlands have been drained over the years to try and improve grazing, and for all sorts of reasons. And we've drained for forestry and lots of different land uses. So a lot of it, the hydrology is affected by the drainage. We've got a sort of modified situation where we've kind of got intact peatland, but it's the wrong sorts of vegetation, and that might be through sort of graining and burning regimes in the past. And then we've got our near natural condition, which is just about as close to a natural system as we can. And just quickly, I wanted to illustrate, the kind of carbon implications of these different condition states. So you can see we have a huge amount of carbon being lost. These numbers here of tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year. And, our actively eroding sites are big, big carbon sources. So it's really vital that we are working on these sites. And you can see, depending on the kind of range of impacts on the sites, we've got 4.5 tons of CO2 from our drains, and that improves to 2.5. And, your near natural systems, round 0, round 1. So the whole point of our restoration is we're trying to improve peatland condition. And this has allowed us to, having these carbon figures has allowed us to understand the carbon implications of peatland restoration. And that's been a really, really strong message for investment in peatland restoration. And, we can have some quite significant carbon savings. So even when you're talking about carbon in peatlands, you can still talk in quite simple terms. And these figures and these condition categories all relate back to the peatland code as well. So they are very commonly used phrases. However, it's much more than just carbon. Peatlands are our biggest carbon sink in our carbon store, in the whole of the UK. We really need to make sure our peatlands are in good condition. We've done calculations and we estimate there's about 140 years worth of our annual national greenhouse gas emissions locked up in our peatlands. So even a small part of those peatlands degrading every year, losing carbon, could have big implications for some of our climate targets and our greenhouse gas targets. But it's more than carbon. It's biodiversity. We're facing a biodiversity crisis, and our peatlands, they are incredibly important habitats in themselves. They host lots of specialist species, so biodiversity, sort of concerns around biodiversity always key as well when we're considering peatland restoration. However, we have to recognise that peatlands underpin a lot of what we do in Scotland. They're managed for farming, for shooting enterprises, for stocking, for forestry. Also, as you'll know, developments, we have wind farms on our peatlands as well, and we used to do quite a bit of commercial extraction of peatlands in the past too, and that's now being kind of phased out. So important in terms of the function and for our rural economy, but there's also an awful lot more going on, and this is where we're starting to realise the impact of some of the restoration. So we can actually make improvements for water quality, to improve drinking water quality, but also water quality for the likes of salmon and trout and our invertebrates in our watercourses. We're starting to understand the role peatlands play in natural flood mitigation as well. But there's other things. You look at the iconic pictures of Scotland, they're often of kind of upland peat bogs with a lovely deer standing on them. They're kind of iconic, they're part of who we are in this country. So very important for landscape, tourism and cultural and historic environment heritage as well. Okay, so peatland action then. This is where I take you through some really quite text-heavy slides, but please don't worry, as I said, I can make these available to you. I want to really take you through what it is we do, some of the key points, so you understand how this funding mechanism works. Now Peatland Action absolutely funds the vast majority of peatland restoration at the moment in Scotland. What I'll be talking to you today about is the kind of peatland action process of application, project design and project delivery. Now this will vary if you're in national parks, because national parks now get direct funding from the Scottish Government to deliver peatland restoration, and that's the same with Forestry Land Scotland too and Scottish Water. So they may have different processes in terms of how they administer grant funding and how some of the criteria and conditions around a grant. But generally we're all trying to still kind of be part of Peatland Action. Peatland Action is the kind of bigger umbrella that tries to make sure we're all working together and we're all kind of tying up what we do nicely. So I'm going to talk you through Peatland Action, but if you're from national parks, I know a few of you are today, please bear in mind that the processes might be slightly different. But in Peatland Action, the national scheme, we are funding up to 100% of capital works, and they are the actual costs associated with restoration. So that's the digger hire, that's staff time driving the digger, it's buying the materials and the equipment to do the restoration work, it's some of the project management costs as well. So we pay for all of that. As I said as well, Peatland Action pay for the likes of me as a project officer to facilitate and support these restoration projects, and that really is quite critical to the kind of scale delivery that we're doing. We do fund projects beyond just restoration projects. We fund what we call feasibility studies, and these are particularly for sites that are very, very large. So they could be whole deer management group ranges, or they could be complex. They might be a forest to bog type project. So where we feel there's additional need for capacity and resource to really do sort of the survey work, understand what the constraints might be and come up with a restoration design, then we will fund feasibility studies, and that's usually delivered by external consultants. You don't get any management payment with Peatland Action, you purely just get the upfront cost of capital works. But as I said, you get a lot of advice through the kind of project officer support. We have been working to financial years, so we have our funding announced towards the beginning of a financial year, and we have to deliver and spend that money by the end of the financial year, which means we have a very rapid turnaround. We're very, very busy. We're usually always doing restoration through the winter months, just because that's the way the sort of grant system works, but also that's often the best time to be doing restoration if you've got sort of breeding birds on site. You might have other sort of sporting interests, that sort of thing. So usually the winter months are best for some reasons, but obviously that means we're working in the worst of the winter weather, which can really slow things up and become a bit of a problem. The winter just gone by, for example, was extremely wet, so there were some sites we couldn't fully finish. We will usually fund all scale of project, all different types of project, but we do have a really ambitious area target. The key thing though is that every restoration project is different, and restoration is designed specifically for that site. No two sites are the same, so it takes quite a lot of work to come up with a really good solid restoration plan. So some of the conditions around Peatland Action funding, well, you know, you need to report on delivery of that restoration. We ask for a lot of spatial data, a lot of reporting, a lot of photographs. We also require a peat depth survey. Those peat depths now feed into some peat slide risk assessment processing that we do as well. So we will assess sites for peat slide risk assessment, and that peat depth information is very useful for that. We will, each project will have a grant given with conditions that last 10 years. So there's basically signing up to a 10-year contract to make sure the sites that we've restored stay in that condition that they were restored to, and that's the responsibility of the landowner, the applicant to Peatland Action. So it's not without conditions, these grants, but there again, there is support for the kind of ongoing monitoring and reporting of the restoration. The key thing, as you might expect, is we want excellent value for money and significant impact, which does become tricky when you're working on very complex, very eroding sites, which can be extremely expensive to restore. Significant impact at the moment is really talked about in terms of scale of delivery in hectares. We may be moving in the future to reporting on carbon, so that's when your actively eroding sites would look really good because you're saving a lot of carbon by restoring those sites. But at the end of the day, we want best practice restoration. We understand that we're learning about restoration every year. I am in charge of the technical compendium in Peatland Action, and this is basically our brain dump from project officers about all things to do with the different restoration techniques. And we're using different techniques year on year. We're improving, we're developing techniques, we're learning from them, we're understanding when they're not working, what situations they're not working. So it's always a process of learning and sort of knowledge sharing. We really want the best quality restoration projects as possible, and that's really what we design for. Okay, now there's loads of information online about Peatland Action. So again, we'll send you around these links, but if you just Google Peatland Action NatureScot, you can find a whole load of information from the information library. You can find all the application forms, and it might be useful for you to have a look at the application form, which I'll go through quickly in a wee moment, just so you can see the kind of things that we're being asked for as part of the application process. But really now I'm going to take you through a year in the life of a project officer and how we approach a project and how we build up a project from scratch into a project we can deliver and restore usually that financial year. So we have an inquiry process. People can get in touch with a local project officer or can go to NatureScot centrally and they'll put people in touch with the right officer for their region. And we are getting a lot of inquiries now. I would say in my time with Peatland Action, we've gone from kind of going out and drumming up business to actually drowning in inquiries. We have a lot of people interested for lots of different reasons. So we're very, very busy and we're really delighted that people are so interested now in peatland restoration and management. So we deal with that initial inquiry, and that might be a landowner coming to us and saying, I have this part of the farm that I know is peatland, what can I do here? It could be an entire estate saying, what could I do where? Where's my peatland? You can start from very, very scant information, and then the process then is to understand the extent of your peatland in the area, the condition of the peatland in the area. We'll do lots of field work and site visits to understand peatland and the restoration needs. And as part of that, it's about understanding what the constraints are for peatland restoration, but what the opportunities are as well. So we might be thinking about peatland restoration in a farming context. So a practical example may be if there are problematic artificial drains where stock might be falling and getting lost. That could be a problem in some areas. We might look at prioritising sorting out those drains so they're not a problem. So certainly, personally speaking, our approach in this region is very much trying to get peatland restoration to fit with wider land management interests. So we'll do a lot of survey work, understand what is where, what could be done. We'll also be doing the peat depth survey. So we have a very standardised way of doing a peat depth survey. So we gather depths from 100-metre grids, and that helps us to an extent inform the kind of restoration process, but also it feeds back nationally on peat depth across the country, and we've got a really good database now full of peat depths and condition and extent for Scotland, which is great information to have. This, as I said, will inform the peat slide risk assessment, and we've worked with an external consultant on this, so I know that there's peat slide risk assessing that's done as part of developments. Wind farms, for example, we've now adopted some of the same principles and worked it into the Peatland Action and Peatland Restoration sort of process. So we're looking for sites that might be vulnerable to peat slides and mass movement of peats. And if we see there's a vulnerability, then that will inform the restoration that we do. And if the risk is too high, we might not even do restoration. But the sites that we're working, the risk of peat slides is very, very slim. But please be reassured that there's a really concise and detailed assessment that we now go through, which is very helpful for all of us. We'll also be thinking about what else is going on these sites too, and who else do we need to be talking to. So a big part of my job as a project officer is making sure all the right people know and are consulted on the restoration projects that we're developing. So, for example, at designated sites, we would be talking to NatureScot about, would there be any impact of the restoration that's getting planned on sensitive species? What sort of mitigation could be put in place? Is the work we're doing going to be of overall benefit? If it's in a drinking water catchment, then we liaise with Scottish Water. What do we need to put in place to make sure we're not going to have negative short-term impacts on any water, drinking water? But obviously, peatland restoration in the long term should benefit drinking water catchments. Also, we're liaising now heavily with the Historic Environment Scotland, and they are helping us understand if there are any historic environment concerns in areas, what we can do to make sure that they are not impacted. We'll also speak to sort of raptor study groups locally, understand what breeding birds might be in some areas, understand who holds the records for different kind of species. So we'll make sure everything that we do is not going to have any negative, harmful impacts. Obviously, SEPA will be consulted if, for example, there are water crossings we need to consider, and when we're accessing sites, we'll come on to car licence as well, but that is a consideration as guidance as well that we follow. If we're looking at forest to bog projects, so removal of trees to restore back to open bog habitat, then we'll go to Scottish Forestry or make sure the applicant understands any felling licence requirements or anything like that. And I said, you know, peat depth survey, but also obviously we're talking to the landowner and managers as well, understanding how the area is managed. Are the pressures from livestock and deer, are they in tune with delivering good long-term sustainable peatland restoration? Is deer being managed? They're not too high in numbers and density that might be an impact. So there's a lot of people that we go to, and really any sort of gold standard peatland restoration project, certainly any peatland action project, should be talking to these wide range of stakeholders throughout. So once everybody is happy, hopefully you've come up with a restoration plan. That restoration plan we'd then put to contractors, and we would get quotes for the work, and that goes in as part of our application to the grants team in NatureScot. And they will assess each application and go through the criteria, make sure it meets the criteria, make sure that we have talked to all the right people, that they have the right information, they have the right data to hand, and they will approve the restoration project and give out the grant, hopefully, to the applicant. And I should say in Peatland Action, the contract exists between the landowner and NatureScot. The project officers are there just to facilitate the process. The landowner, the applicant, would have to pay the contractor upfront, and then they claim back from NatureScot. So that's kind of how the contractual and kind of money side of it works. So through the Peatland Action assessment of all applications, there's usually quite a bit of liaising with the applicant and project officer. So there's always a two-way conversation or three-way conversation between us all to make sure that everybody's happy. If there's any tweaks required to that restoration plan, they can be made, and just, as I said, make sure that we've considered everything, and we're going to really do the best restoration project we can. Okay, so hopefully you've got your grant, that's come through. We then re-engage our contractors, so we've hopefully got some quotes already from contractors. We've got our chosen contractor, we engage with them, we start the sort of delivery side of the project, we have our site inception meeting. All of our restoration projects now fall under construction design management regulations in terms of health and safety. So we have quite a rigid process that we work through to make sure everybody understands their health and safety responsibilities. And then we go through our restoration reporting. As I said, again, if you're working with a project officer, that officer is likely to be out liaising, you know, consistently with the contractor to make sure the project stays on spec, stays on time. If it doesn't, often they don't, because we're working in very challenging sites and all sorts of things can happen. We might have to tweak the design of the restoration as we go because we realise some techniques are working better than others. But there's always that conversation between ourselves and the grants team to make sure everybody understands the implications of that. And then hopefully you've delivered your wonderful restoration project. We then have a final site inspection, a final report, with associated spatial data that's submitted to Peatland Action in a set format, and all this information, of course, gets reported back to Scottish Government. So there's quite a lengthy process with a lot of people involved at all the different stages, but all with the overall aim to deliver on time and to spec and to the best restoration that we can. And yes, we live in the real world and things do change, but with that process of communication, if there are changes to a job, then everybody can be informed. So communication is absolutely critical throughout. Okay, again, I've taken this straight out the application form, and I just wanted to highlight some of the key things that were asked for in the application form, just to show how thorough we are. So you can get all this information, of course, if you go online, go to the Peatland Action website, you can download a copy of the application form so you can see for yourselves. But I thought it would be useful at this point just to reiterate how thorough things are. And yes, as the project's developed over the past 10 years, it has got more complicated, but quite rightly so. So there's quite a bit of information here about the landowner, or if you're an agent, what your relationship is to the landowner, to make sure any contracts, we know who we're having the contracts between. Also, land ownership, if there's more than one landowner, we want to make sure everybody's involved. That's very important. And we have these letters of appointment of key duty holders. And again, this is really important from a CDM, construction design management, health and safety point of view as well. We want to know, are they receiving any funding? That might be agri environment funding, anything else, to make sure we're not double funding anything, to make sure the funding that we're doing might be complementing work that's happened in the past or currently. Key thing is, have you discussed this application with a member of NatureScot staff or Peatland Action Project officers? Hopefully everybody has, and so that means the grant team know that there's been that level of support throughout, and they know that there's somebody else they can go to for any kind of queries they may have on an application. Obviously, we flag up, we ask which local planning authority area the project will be taking place in, and we now flag up the fact that permitted development rights for peatland restoration schemes have come into force. So this is now really flagged up quite heavily, which is really useful at this application stage. We also ask if there are any utilities on the site. This is pretty critical when we're passing information to contractors, obviously. Any kind of overhead power lines, anything like that might need to be considered as part of the restoration works and how we work in that area. Are you in a drinking water protected area? Are there any scheduled monuments or archaeological remains on a site? We also ask if we plan to block any watercourses which appear in a 1 to 50,000 scale map, because that has implications for car licensing, and we'd be liaising with SEPA. I would say generally we don't work in watercourses. Even if they look man-made and they appear in a 1 to 50,000 map, we wouldn't go near them. So we're only working on the artificial sections of any sort of kind of hydrological sort of feature, if you like, on a site. We ask about deer management groups, we ask about deer numbers at livestock, we ask about Schedule 1 birds, breeding birds, other protected species as well. So we're always asking the questions to make sure that all the relevant people have been kept informed about the project. We ask for a lot of detailed data as well on a site. So we ask for location. We ask for a lot of spatial data as well, which I won't go into here, but we have a whole spatial data template that people need to work to. We want them to flag up what designations a site may have, the current use, the current condition of the peatland, and of course the area. So we're already kind of drilling down and making sure we've got all the information on record. Obviously, we want to know how much it's going to cost and what we intend to do, and we'll fill out tables like this. This tells you the meterage, for example, of an eroding hag that you might be reprofiling. So lots and lots of detail goes into the application, and as I said, this is all linked back to cost. Okay, so that's a really quick sort of whistle-stop tour of the Peatland action process. And I hope that's really highlighted just how rigorous we are in developing these projects and making sure that we minimise any sort of impacts they may have. Obviously, what we want to do in the long term is to make sure that all these projects have really, really good long-term benefit for a whole range of things. But yeah, so there's the process there. I put this slide up just to flag up. Do put any questions you have into the chat box, and we'll try to get to them by the end of the session today. I think we'll just keep going.
Can I just jump in, Emily? There's one probably to address just now before we move on. Someone's asking what consultation you have with council historic environment teams, because you mentioned HES earlier on.
Yeah. So we've recently started quite a big conversation with Historic Environment Scotland, and they are putting together some guidance for us, and certainly they've done some training with the project officers to make sure we know who to talk to. And so that they're kind of facilitating that at the moment, but of course that will be different, possibly in different local authority areas. But I think generally we know we would get in touch with our local authorities if there's any sort of hint of concern. But we have a great contact, Tom Gardner, who we're working with in HES, and he's helping us kind of navigate our way through this.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to take any more questions just now, or do you want to move on and we can kind of address them as we go?
Yeah, if there's any questions on what I've just shown, then that would be great.
Yeah, there's one here on the application form that's just come in. Someone's asking if you could add in a requirement for a report of the biological records from the local record centre in that form. More a statement than a question as such.
I'll certainly make the suggestion.
The other questions I have, we'll probably touch upon during the presentation part later. I'll bring them up if they're still relevant. So I'll let you move on just now.
Great, thank you very much. Can you still see the screen okay?
Yeah, the screen's still there.
Great, brilliant, thank you. Okay, right, now we get into the really fun stuff, and this is talking about peat forming habitats and terminology, and then we're going to talk a bit about the actual restoration itself. So I thought, I know some of you know a lot about peatlands, and I know some of you probably know less about peatlands, so I'm going to go right back to basics and again just talk about some of the really common terms that you'll hear when we're talking about peatland restoration, particularly in Peatland Action. We're definitely about simplifying how we talk about peatlands so that it's meaningful to as many people as possible. But really, we'll be looking at two main types of peatland when we talk about peatland restoration in Scotland. The first one is the lowland raised bog. Now, lowland raised bogs are found particularly around the central belt, in Dumfries and Galloway, around the Solway, up in Aberdeenshire and some of the Lothians as well. Lowland raised bogs are really, really big, deep deposits of peat, and they've formed from glacial lakes since the last ice age. So as the ice melted, retreated, these glacial lakes formed, and they've slowly infilled with vegetation over time, become a wetland. Slowly that vegetation, very slowly, has sort of decayed slow and built up into a sort of mound of organic material, a mound of peat. And so suddenly you get a system that's actually rainwater fed only, which means it's very nutrient poor and then has the characteristics of a peatland. So they tend to be sort of islands, if you like, of deep peat deposits amongst a sea of quite contrasting land uses. This is an aerial photograph I put here of a site in Dumfries and Galloway, and you can see the bog in the middle, and it's surrounded by trees, and then you're surrounded by kind of quite intensive agriculture round about. So when we're working on lowland raised bogs, we're often considering the edge and considering the work that we're doing on our bogs, make sure that we're not having any influence on any sort of systems out with either that land holding or out with the bog itself. So we're often considering how do we maintain and keep water on the site and stop it flowing off into any boundary drains that we can't touch. So we're often talking small sites in terms of area, but really, really carbon intense sites, if you like. And some of our deepest peats in Scotland are in lowland raised bogs. And, you know, getting a measurement of 11 metres plus of peat in these sites is not uncommon. This is what a typical raised bog may look like. A lot of them have been drained in the past, so they may be supporting quite a lot of tree growth, a lot of heather growth, for example. Some of them can be supporting a lot of scrub. A lot of lowland raised bogs were planted with trees in the past. And even with the tree removal, we're seeing really, really dense scrub. So that's often the thing that we're looking at to manage on these lowland raised bogs. And it's worth pointing out at this stage that, you know, we're not peatlands versus trees. We're all about peatland functionality, making sure the hydrology is right. And yes, if these sites revert into kind of wet woodland sort of scenario in the future, then that might be the case. But certainly we often have very, very dry bogs because they've been artificially drained. They've got artificially cut edges. That tree and regen extent and growth is an issue. And here's just an illustration of the kind of depth of peat we could be looking at. This again is a site near me, and you can see this is your bog here, and there's trees on the edge of it, and you can't quite make it out, but there's an orange peat probe. So this is a way that we take a peat depth measurement. We have a rod that we screw in sections and keep pushing it down in the peat till we hit the bottom, we hit the bedrock, the mineral layer. And we've pulled that peat probe back out of that bog intact, and we've leant it against a tree. And there you can see the top of the peat probe there. So, you know, when you consider the amount of peat you're sanding on, it's quite remarkable in some of these lowland raised bogs. Okay, so that's first term to remember, lowland raised bog. Second term, blanket bogs. Blanket bogs are, as they sound, extensive areas that blanket the countryside, usually in the uplands, but these are your really, really big areas of peatland. They can often look quite sort of uniform, quite brown. They might be dominated by grasses. They might be eroding in places, so condition can be quite variable over even quite small spatial scales. Your peat tends to be shallower in blanket bogs, or 2 meters, 1, 2, 3 meters, that sort of thing. But you may well get pockets of deeper peat as well within that blanket bog. And this is where it's really important to do a peat depth survey, so you know where your peat is, where your peat runs out, where your deeper peat lenses might be as well. So peat depths can actually tell us a lot about where the extent of these blanket bogs are. So they're your two main things you need to remember, blanket bog and lowland raised bog. We also, we don't really work so much at the moment on fens, but fens are basically, again, big layers of organic material. Peats often tend to be more nutrient rich because they're fed by groundwater as well, so more sort of lush growth. Often lots more standing water as well, but yeah, again, slightly different to the kind of normal peatlands that we're working on. So really the two key habitats we're working on, lowland raised bog and blanket bog, and it's as simple as that. There's a whole load of literature out there that splits them all up further into all different sorts of categories, but we're only fussed with lowland raised bog, blanket bog. Nice and simple. Now this leaflet is available, as peatland condition assessment is available online, and you can get a copy from the Peatland Action website. And again, this talks about peatland condition. Again, we talk about peatland condition in very simple terms. So if you remember back to the slide I showed you about carbon emissions, those are the terms really that we're using. We use the near natural, modified, drained, actively eroding, currently under forestry, currently under scrub. And that's as far as we really go in describing peatland condition. Again, of course, you can split that down further, but in terms of how that informs our restoration planning, the potential for carbon improvements in an area and the kind of restoration that we need to do, that's enough for us. So we don't go into any more detail unless we need to, and we may commission additional surveys, NVC surveys, phase 1 habitat, if we feel that is required. Okay, so I'm now going to talk you through the different conditions of a peatland. And apologies for those of you who know all of this, but hopefully it's useful. It will help you understand how we talk about peatlands, certainly from a peatland restoration point of view. Okay, so our near natural peatland systems, this is what we're aiming for really with our restoration. This is what we'd love all of our peatlands to look at. And the key thing here is lots and lots of sphagnum moss. Now, sphagnum moss is a moss that you can pull up off the ground, off the surface, and you can usually squeeze it and lots of water comes out. Sphagnum moss is really important for keeping a peatland wet. You need a peatland wet so it doesn't dry out. You need a peatland wet so it has the right species on it, and you need a peatland wet so it long term is a carbon store. So lots of sphagnum, indication that the hydrology is right, the site is wet, and you're kind of, yeah, it's functioning okay. Bog pools, an amazing habitat in itself, a really good indication that your system is functioning well. Obviously, if you have bog pools, natural bog pools on your site, you wouldn't be going anywhere near them. They're very precious, they're very sensitive, so we would leave well alone. But if you've got bog pools, that's a great sign. Okay, but we have a lot of drains. A huge area of our peatlands have been drained in the past, and this is to improve it for forestry, farming, all sorts of things. The idea being that you want to get more grazing, better grazing for the likes of sheep. So we have a lot of drainage, and of course the government paid for drainage in the past as well, so it was incentivised. And some of you may well be familiar looking at aerial photographs, but you'll see here just a snapshot, and all these straight linear features are all the artificial drains. So you can see lots of them everywhere. You can get drains that are cut, you know, very standard like this, and sort of straight lines right across the site. You might get odd sort of wandering drains as well like this. So they can vary in terms of what they look like, but they are kind of everywhere. And we do a lot of drain restoration to try and improve the hydrology. We talk very much in terms of hydrological units. So it can be quite daunting when you're presented with an entire hillside and you've got to fathom out a restoration project. What you'll start to do is you'll understand shedding points, you'll understand how the drains connect up. So for example, you would want to do all your restoration of all these drains in that area, and then all over here, you wouldn't want to be doing just a few over here and a few over here. You try and sort the whole hydrological unit out at a time. So you can see this hill actually splits quite nicely into all the different sort of drainage units, if you like. And you can see all the different types of kind of drains that you can find. But you see drains everywhere, and as I said, it's a really common practice for us to do ditch blocking and reprofiling. They can look in all sorts of kind of innocuous sort of ways. Here's a drain, I think probably fairly freshly cleared out. Certainly it's kind of very active, so a lot of water moving through those drains, but kind of standard 50 centimetres wide, 50 centimetres deep. You can see just over here, this hillside, these drains here that are cut here, some of them actually connect up to the natural water course. These will be fairly old drains. You get strange drains that you can't really see until you fall into them. This is a great example in Loch Lomond where you've got a drain that's kind of infilled probably over time, so a new drain line has been cut next to it. Here's a colleague of mine in a drain that was deeper than she thought, but drain condition can vary quite a lot over a hillside, so it's really important. A good sort of survey has been done at the top, middle and bottom of a site, if you like, because condition can change, and that has implications for how you go about restoring it. This is the same drain, believe it or not, just further down the hill, and this is now actively eroding. So even these quite small drainage features do require intervention and restoration, so you stop things like this happening. So a bit of water coming down here is clearly leading to this erosion, and obviously this is your big carbon loss, your big habitat loss. Bare peat's no good for anybody or anything. So that would definitely be a drain to prioritise for restoration. Further still, on the same site, downslope, you can see how far these drains have eroded out. And then down at the bottom, it can lead to really significant erosion like that, where you've lost a significant amount of peat. So we always kind of work at the top of the system down. We always try and stop water flowing, slow the flow, so it doesn't get to that point where erosion is pretty ferocious down at the bottom. Okay, and then your actively eroding can look like this. So this is a typical upland site. This is in the Moffat Hills, and you can see lots of bare peat, and you see this throughout Scotland. And it's probably all sorts of reasons have caused it, have made it worse, but these tend to be pretty exposed sites. The primary reason doing restoration here is just to stop that peat eroding any further. It's unlikely you'll be able to return the whole area back into that near natural condition, because obviously there's been so much peat loss over the years that the topography has totally changed. So it's a different system, but definitely trying to stop that peat eroding further and help vegetation re-establish on the site is absolutely key. They can be very tricky, complex sites to work in. Obviously, there's a huge amount of water coming through this gully at some point in the year, leading to all this erosion. Also, you can get quite linear features. Some of them may be peat banks, so actually artificially cut edges. and it may have been for domestic peat cutting in the past or even concurrently. But you've also got signs across areas of revegetation. And you can see this site has eroded quite badly in the past, but it's all sort of revegetating with the right sort of species. And you can see that bare peat hag is completely revegetated. So that's what we would want to aim for with restoration. So again, condition varies across the site. So it's really important to make sure the survey has been carried out across an area to make sure that all the range of conditions have been understood and captured. You also get different sort of bare peat features. This is a peat pan that we'd call it. I would call it a peat pan. This could be indicative of, say, a very severe fire that's actually burnt the vegetation and burnt into the peat, and you're left with this very exposed flat expanse of peat. The problem here is this probably fills up with water in the winter, then completely dries out in the summer. So it's a very hard environment for vegetation to re-establish. So again, that'd be a key feature for us to look to restore. And then you may have a site with signs of kind of small discrete areas of bare peat. And this may not look bad just now, but this could be the start of a really quite severe phase of erosion, and you might end up getting gullies forming because of this. So again, even if there's small areas of bare peat, they're very, very important to understand because it may be a sign that site is getting more degraded. And of course, no site is either one thing or the other. You often have a whole range of conditions appearing in one area. So again, this goes back to needing to design a restoration project based on that site, based on the surveys that you do and the site information that you have. But these are complex projects needing lots of multiple different types of intervention. And here again, we do a lot of mapping. It's the same site as this one, just mapped using Google Earth. And here we're picking up the different sort of features. So for example, here are some artificial drains that we've mapped. This is what we'd call micro erosion, these little discrete patches of bare peat. And then obviously you've got your kind of more extensive hagging and gullying. And then obviously you've got some huge gullies as well. So a range of restoration techniques will be required here, which will be expensive and complicated. Your tree scrub situation, it could be you've got conifers jumping onto an open bog site because you've got a seed source nearby. There might be a need to remove some of this conifer encroachment. So we've got Sitka and Lodgepole pine jumping onto this triple SI, actually blanket bog. So obviously, not only do we need to remove the scrub, we need to make sure that site is in a condition where scrub and tree encroachment is suppressed. So usually that's looking at the hydrology and making sure the site is wet enough so we're not just going to get it covered over in conifers. We're also working, as I've said a few times, on forest to bog sites. So these are sites that have been cultivated for conifers in the past, have grown a crop, and that crop has been removed and the decision has been made to restore back to open bog habitat. So in these sorts of situations, we are thinking about not only scrub removal, but blocking up any drains, making sure the hydrology restored, and also the topography as well. You may well have been out on afforested sites and you will have seen how deeply ploughed some sites can be. That ridge and furrow topography needs to be flattened out so you get a kind of gentle, more consistent re-wetting of the site, raising of the water table, and that really, really helps to get the right vegetation coming in, and it suppresses growth of all the kind of tree species that may come through otherwise. Some sites can be so incredibly dense. They may have had the conifers removed, but there's now a standing crop of, birch or something. So again, a lot of work may be required to remove some of these areas of trees. We're very, very mindful though in a situation like this that we wouldn't go in and just clear the whole site at once. We're then understanding it's kind of habitat management. There's a habitat there now. It's not just a clear fell site that's bare peat that needs restored. There's a habitat that needs to be managed. So often these sites will be phased over a number of years to make sure we minimise the impact on any species that may be using a site in that condition. And of course, we have a lot of standing conifer crop on some of our wettest, deepest peats, and that's a big thing for us in Dumfries and Galloway. There'll be some sites that are producing really poor crops of conifer. So the decision is quite a simple one not to replant because these sites did not yield a profitable crop. There are some sites that are a bit more marginal whether that decision is made or not, but more and more we're seeing trees being taken off deep peats and restored back to open bog habitat. Then you get your modified condition, and this is a site where there may well not be any drain features or erosion features, but the vegetation is definitely being impacted. It might be all just heather or all just grass. You don't have your good mix of sphagnum, your cotton grasses, those sorts of things. And that might be because of a fire regime, a muir burn regime in the past or in the present. And it might be through kind of grazing regimes as well. So here we would want to be thinking about sort of longer term management and how these sites are managed. So just because a site doesn't have drains or erosion features doesn't mean it's in really tip-top condition. Often it's a kind of wider management needs to be considered as well. Here's an example of a fire. You can see that it's burnt out parts of the moss layer and obviously burnt out a lot of the vegetation. So it'd be interesting to see how this site responds. So obviously that will have very much a short-term impact on vegetation, but also potentially longer-term impact too. And don't discount how much burning we still see across Scotland. And yeah, you'll see all these little patches here, lighter patches. These are all burn patches here over this area of hillside. Just to point out, if you get a grant through Peatland Action or Peatland Restoration, then you cannot carry out burning for at least 10 years on that site. And that's to protect the restoration works itself. Okay, so restoration then, what are we trying to achieve? And not only can we talk about the next few slides in the context of peatland restoration, but general kind of understanding of peatland condition. And if, for example, you're looking at developments on peatlands, what the implications are going to be in hydrology, which underpins everything on a peatland site. So hopefully just this kind of, you don't need to remember this diagram or anything, but the thing I want to point out here is actually a peatland is a really dynamic ecosystem. There are a lot of processes going on. Here, this shows you the processes around greenhouse gas sequestration and emissions as well. So you can get, naturally, you'll get CO2 sequestered from the atmosphere into your bog through the process of photosynthesis. Those plants then decay very slow, they don't decay totally, and they build up into your peat layers, and that's your long-term storage and accumulation of carbon in that organic matter. However, you can lose CO2 from a site if it's the wrong kind of vegetation, the site is very dry, it's being drained, there's lots of erosion, so you can release CO2 to the atmosphere. Methane as well, which is a more potent greenhouse gas, will naturally be produced in the bog, but you can accelerate how much methane is produced if there's different plants on the bog, different sort of vegetation composition at the height of the water table. So lots and lots of very complex processes. But the really critical thing is most of these processes are underpinned by the water table. And what we mean by the water table, it's the height at which the water table sits within the peat itself. And obviously the water table will rise to surface in the winter and it will fluctuate, go lower in the summer during our drier months. If you have a degraded site, a drain site, an eroding site, that drawdown, that drop of the water table during your drier months will be much, much greater. And that can knock out a lot of these processes and can ultimately lead to the peat drying out, oxidation, release of CO2 to the atmosphere, and overall net source of carbon to the atmosphere. So although it looks brown and boring and uniform, a peatland is actually super, super dynamic with loads of processes going on. But for us, when it comes to restoration, primarily what we're trying to do is stop any erosion of peat, any bare open peat, and restore the water table, restore the hydrological function of a site. So these processes will be in balance and will hopefully lead to a site that is overall a net sink. Although be a small one, it's not going to be a net source of carbon to the atmosphere. And of course, it will then underpin all the right kind of vegetation, all the right species, all the right habitat as well. Now, again, you need to think about how water interacts with a peatland, and it's not that simple, but we can talk about it in simple terms. water reaches a bog through precipitation, through rain, through snowfall events. Some of that water will flow into your peat, and you'll get this very slow movement of water kind of at the pore level through the peat itself. You can also get flow of water over the surface when your bog is totally saturated and water starts flowing over the surface naturally. Or you can get it where the bog somehow is not absorbing water as it should do. So for example, that peat pan image I showed you where there had been a severe fire, because of the action of the fire, it's actually changed the sort of chemical properties of that top layer of peat, and water just simply can't penetrate in anymore. So then you get a flow of water over the surface. And a flow of water over the surface consistently can lead to erosion, particularly if you've got any bits of exposed bare peat as well. So that overland flow can be quite important to understand. Obviously, you'll lose water through the process of evapotranspiration, through part of the process of photosynthesis and respiration of plants. That's natural, but if you have loads of trees on a site, you might get more evapotranspiration, and that might dry the site out further. You also get this thing called pipe flow, and you may well have seen, you often see it on tracks that have been cut through a peat bog. You look at the track side, which might be a wall of peat, and you'll just see these kind of pipes of water, these bursts of water coming out, and these are peat pipes. And peat pipes occur naturally within the peat, and this is basically water flows quite rapidly through them depending on different conditions. However, you can get way more peat pipes on sites, for example, that have been planted with trees, and you get peat pipes coming like sort of 2.5 meters depth within the peat. And so if you do a lot of surface work in terms of trying to improve the ecology and hydrology, but you've not gone deep enough, you can still get a huge amount of water loss through these peat pipes as well. So it's really important to think about how water interacts with the surface of a peatland, what happens within the peat itself, and how water might come into a bog, infiltrate, but also this overland flow as well. So it's all about understanding water flow and what water does. So basically, one of the key things we do is we try and stop and we slow the flow of water. And here is a great example of a drain. So a drain, a big artificial drain used to run up the site here. Hopefully you can see my mouse moving up and down. And you can see these kind of green patches. Well, between these green patches are actually peat dams. And these were constructed with an excavator, a low ground pressure excavator. And these were put into the drain line, and this has stopped the water. It's backed up water. These little pools have formed that have been infilled with sphagnum moss, the right kind of moss. And you can see that we now have a feature that's no longer transporting water off that site. So very basically, that's what we're often trying to do, particularly in our drain sites. However, when we get more actively eroding sites, it's not just straight drains that we're trying to look at. We're actually talking about flow through a gully system. And you can see here, it's obviously been quite wet on the site, and you can see how water is flowing over the surface. It's flowing and cascading into these features here. It's obviously causing erosion. You've got lots of bare peat. So blocking up and slowing the flow through lots of different interventions is really important at this site. So you stop that erosion happening further downstream, and you stop these bare areas getting eroded any further. You have to understand how all these features interact with the natural water courses and the natural water system. So for example, to me, I can't be sure, I've not looked at the map, the West map, but this looks like a natural water course. But to me, this doesn't. So this looks like this would be the area that would slow the flow. This looks like an artificial drain. So this is where we would do our restoration work. We wouldn't be working, of course, in the water course at all. Here again, this looks like a gully that's forming, and you can see some small interventions up here, stop the water flowing in, and then some work here to cover over that bare peat would be important. And here's the same site again from a different angle, and you can see how water is sort of moving towards that natural water course through the site. So water can be a pretty ferocious force on our peatland sites. This is me kind of doing the equivalent of scratching my head, not knowing quite what to do with this. But this is the kind of erosion that it can lead to. This is what we call it a peat canyon. It's a bit more than just a gully. It's enormous. So here it's all about stopping the water getting to this point. because here any sort of restoration work will be massively expensive at this point, but we can do a lot of work upstream of this feature to make sure the water coming through here is not quite so powerful, is not going to be quite so erosive. So you might not do any sort of blocking or anything here to stop the water flow. We might do some work on the edges to cover over the bare peat, but here it's much more looking up the system and slowing the flow before it gets to that point. Okay, so restoration considerations. We know that we want to slow the flow of water. We know we would need to improve the water table and the overall hydrology. We know that there are artificial drains that we could be working on, and there's some bare peat we need to be covering. However, all this happens often in the same site. And this image here is from, I think, Loch Lomond direction. It just shows you how complex some of these sites are. So we do a lot, it would take a lot of time to do a lot of mapping using aerial photographs, lots of site surveys to try and understand what can be done where. And this site here, to me, I would be probably looking at a phased project over 1, 2, 3 years, and probably working at the top, working down, slowing the flow of water as we go. But these are complex sites. They require bespoke planning, but this is what we do. This is what we're really good at, and this is why what we do works. Okay, so we'll have a break in about 20 minutes time, but before we have a break, I want to really talk about really some of the conditions around peatland restoration, what we do, what kit we use, because it can seem quite terrifying that we're taking out big huge machines onto our peat bogs. But I can reassure you that usually we have excellent machines and usually good drivers that know what they're doing, and we have very few kind of problems with that. You know, people work on peatland all the time, and we're utilising people, for example, that have worked on hill tracks, that have worked forestry, have worked on wind farm developments, are used to working on deep peat, coming and doing some of our restoration work. So here is an example of, this is what we call a peat hag here. You can see it's kind of sort of folding over itself here, but what this machine is doing is a technique called reprofiling. And this is basically tamping down the edge so it becomes much more stable, much more covered over the vegetation, and will really help kind of long-term restoration. That should be stabilised from further erosion. And we're doing that using a low ground pressure excavator. And this is an excavator, this looks kind of like your 14-ton sort of size, on very wide tracks. And we have very wide tracks to reduce the overall ground pressure, usually to less than 3 psi, which is quite amazing. Often the machines we're doing the restoration with are absolutely great. The concerns we have is often how are the drivers getting to those machines on a daily basis. You know, quad bikes become an issue, tracked vehicles might become an issue. So we're always very conscious of, yes, your low ground pressure excavators are great, but what machines are you using to access the site overall? But this is standard sort of equipment. What's very good with this machine is it has a tilt head rotator, I think they call it. It's a bucket basically that tips, so it's very, very easy to manipulate, and it's perfect for this kind of restoration work. Here again, similar sort of machine, very kind of large machine. This is up in Isle of Lewis, wide tracks again, and yeah, this guy had actually he'd worked on peatlands on Lewis, as you'd imagine, for years and years and years. And we were talking through the reprofiling technique on an old abandoned peat bank, and he said, actually, I think you could do it like this. So he thought on his feet, and he actually came up with a better way of doing that restoration, that technique in that context, which is great. And he was just using a kind of standard sort of big bucket, and he was using that just to tamp down the sides. So often it can be down to the driver and the equipment available as to exactly how a technique is carried out. We're quite careful not to be really, really over prescriptive on how a technique is carried out. What we try and instill in the driver and the contractor is what we're trying to achieve. So here it's about covering over that peat bank to make sure it's not going to be eroding any further. And you will get a short-term kind of impact of some, you can see peat's been brought up to surface here, but this very, very quickly settles, and this can be an amazing technique. Very quickly you see a much better landscape because of it. Again, here's another machine. I've got a million pictures of diggers, so I'll go through some of those. But again, great. So this is a smaller machine actually. Again, low ground pressure. You can see working on quite a wet site. And here, obviously, the machines would always stick to working at the top. They wouldn't be tracking into these wetter, open peat areas. Again, this kind of tilting bucket that they've got here, which is ideal for this kind of technique. And this is up in the Highlands at Achnasheen, this site. You'll maybe need different machines for different things, not necessarily just using a bucket on a digger to do the reprofiling or ditch blocking, just the actual force of the machine, the power a machine has itself. So you can actually use the back of a bucket of an excavator or even special kind of heads you put on the excavator to help bash in plastic piling, for example, and help drive that into the peat. And here, this is basically what we call a composite dam. We've blocked a big drain here with plastic piling, and we've covered it over peat on this side, so it's very, very strong, and that's been turfed over as well. So we have tried doing techniques by hand in areas where machine access or even machine sourcing is very difficult, but you kind of do need that power of the excavator to really do very well consolidated peat dams, any peat structures, driving in piling, reprofiling. Really, it is a machine job. Obviously, you'll get really specialist stuff that will come in. You'll get forestry equipment, so obviously there'll be forestry equipment associated with the removal of trees. Here you have an example again of plastic piling being driven in by a special kind of top here. Again, quite a lot of engineering going into that. I would say I think I've started to see less people using plastic piling. There's less people enthused about putting plastic into bogs. We're definitely moving more to wood and peat composite. We now know that you can do an awful lot with good peat to produce really good dams with peat, but sometimes you might need something a bit more engineered like this. Yeah, and here's some big old forestry machine, and you can see just how wide the tracks are, again, to stop that machine bogging in, very low ground pressure, and actually leaves very little trace behind a lot of these machines. You also get some special kits here, and this is for cutting a layer of heather and cotton grass. And this is, we were producing what we call the living mulch that we then spread onto areas of bare peat on the same site. So you're moving a seed source around on the same site, and that could be very effective. Obviously, there's some sites where this wouldn't be very useful. They might be too rocky, might be too hard to access. So again, it's kind of horses for courses depending on your site. Yeah, just another picture of very, very wide tracks. Just to reiterate, we have diggers with very wide tracks, which is great when they're on the bog. Can be a bit of a nuisance when you're trying to get machines to a site. So obviously access and tracks and roads and bridges are all things that we consider. All of our restoration projects, really the ideal is we have contractors that come out on site, see the site before they quote for the work, so they can help us understand what any access issues might be. If it's a 9-foot gate or a 12-foot gate, it can be quite critical for these things. So again, we try and make sure contractors have the knowledge that they need. Again, some contractors have modified machines as well. So this contractor actually cut sections of the track out from this side and this side here, and that he felt that was better when you were moving, you were kind of tracking corners, you weren't running up the bog as much. So there's a lot of skilled people doing this. There's a lot of people thinking of ways of doing this better, and there's a lot of innovation going on as well in the kit that we're using. Key thing is, certainly from a kind of ecological perspective, but probably mostly health and safety, is working 2 machines on a site. We'd always specify that 2 machines are working on a site, and that's really if a machine gets into bother. If it gets stuck, we don't want any machines getting bogged. On particularly wet sites, not only do we have low ground pressure machines and wide tracks, but we will have bog mats as well that we'll put in sensitive areas. So always thinking about machines and how they move across the site is very, very important. Refueling, of course, has to be a consideration. I should say that we use a lot of the kind of forest and water guidelines around all of this. This is what our contractors are used to working to. So that's absolutely the minimum spec will be in the forest and water guidelines. Sediment traps, I don't think this is a particularly good example of a sediment trap, but yes, we'll consider sediment traps as and when we need to as well, and we'll take advice from SEPA or Scottish Water, particularly for a drinking water catchment. That might be a major consideration. But really, it's probably worth just saying before we start going through the restoration techniques themselves is we don't want to just go in all guns blazing, throwing the kitchen sink at everything. It really is horses for courses. It's about doing not the least amount of work, but it's been doing work in a sensitive way that we're not overdoing it. If a site just needs simple ditch blocking and a bit of repo, then that's what we'll do. However, some sites, particularly I would say the forest to bog sites, need quite a lot of work to get them to go back, to start reverting back to that open bog habitat with the right hydrology. So that's when you get sort of the highest amount of intervention disturbances on those sites. And the kind of way I look at it personally is you think about the amount of work that was put into modifying that site to become something else. That's kind of the amount of work you have to put back into it to bring it back to what it should be. So if it's just some simple drains that have been cut on a hillside, well, that's a simple project. It's a simple machine that can go out and do some simple peat dams. However, if you've ploughed a site for forestry, you've drained a site for forestry, you've done all sorts of ground prep to try and get a conifer crop to establish, then that's a lot of resources going into that. You're going to need that sort of equivalent resource, and that's longer time frame to really realise a reversion back to that open bog sort of scenario. So it really is horses for courses. We're not just doing everything because we can at a site. It is very carefully considered. And of course, value for money. We need to make sure our sites that we're working on is not crazy money. They need to be value for money. We require 3 quotes per job usually, so we know that the prices are coming in are sensible. So it is, value for money is a big driver for what we do in Peatland Action, but we still at the same time want to do the best restoration possible. Okay, right. You've got 10 minutes to go and then you'll get a break and you don't need to listen to me for 20 minutes. But we've got a bit of time before we break to start talking about restoration techniques. And really, this is just a whole series of photographs of different types of restoration. Hopefully it will put you at ease a bit about the kind of work that we're doing. We're not talking about huge amounts of peat being manipulated and redistributed across the site. We're talking about very, very local scale interventions. We're talking about carefully considered interventions and a whole range of different techniques that we can deploy across sites. As I said before, I think that we've got this technical compendium in Peatland Action, and it's not published yet. It will be published. We're hoping to put out guidance notes on each individual technique. But these are always evolving, and we're always learning, and we're always sharing our best practice from across the country and beyond. Actually, we liaise a lot with contractors and project designers south of the border as well, and we're always learning what we're doing. But we're very sure and very, very keen that we communicate well the kind of what we're trying to achieve with restoration. So I'm going to go through some of the common techniques. So hopefully, at the very least, you'll get to understand the sort of terminology that's being used. And when you get an application in that talks about ditch blocking or hag reprofiling, at least you've got an idea of what that looks like on the ground. Okay, so firstly, most simple thing that we'll probably do is ditch blocking. And ditch blocking we've been doing for ages and ages. We're doing it more and more just with peat dams. So this is a great technique for working on kind of your standard artificial hill drains, particularly. All you're doing is you're building peat dams out of the peat that's there. So you're not having to bring on material from elsewhere. You don't have to bring in sort of plastics or woods or anything like that. Basically, you get a low ground pressure machine out there working in pairs, and you can construct the features as you go. And this is a freshly dug peat dam, and a good example actually. So this is your drain line here, and above and down slope, and you can see they have borrowed peat from over here. So that means they've actually taken a bucket of peat from elsewhere, usually kind of with the digger arms kind of width away, bring it back, and they've tamped that into the drain feature. They've borrowed some turf, probably from the same borrow pit, and they've turfed it over, keyed it in really well at the edges. So that's formed quite a good seal, a good structure, and that's going to slow and stop the flow of water from going further downstream. And we're usually constructing peat dams, depending on the gradient, about 7 meters, 10 meters kind of max apart. So lots and lots of interventions up and down a drain line. And these are really effective. This looks a bit kind of bare peaty at the moment, if you like. This is just freshly dug. Very quickly this settles down, and very quickly you can't even see where these dams are until you're sort of standing on one. And a good driver, and it's hammered home to our drivers, that if they're boring peat, they have to reinstate the borrow pits. And they do that by scraping over the surrounding turf over that area. So we don't want any areas of bare peat left open. All these borrow pits should be very, very well dressed, and they're usually pretty used to doing that sort of work. Here's a peat dam that's settled a bit, again on the same site, and you can see this is your peat dam, really well turfed over, and it's backing up water and it's stopping. There's still actually a bit of water in the drain below, but there'll be water flow kind of coming down the slope reaching that drain, hence why you need lots of different dams, lots of dams up a drain line. But that's working well. And that's relatively cheap to do as well, really easy, relatively cheap. Now you may need to do slightly more engineering on particularly big drains, and usually this is when we're talking about artificial drains, probably most often lowland raised bogs where there's big, big deep drains that have been cut. And here you can see there's a plastic piling dam that's been put in and braced as well with a wooden brace here. And that not only supports the plastic piling, but see this, there's usually a notch cut in the middle of your dam, and this, so you'll get a little overspill, and this stops water backing up and flowing around. But that overspill is caught with that wooden brace, so you're not getting kind of erosion of the peat below that overspill, which is really useful. But as I say, we're kind of moving away more and more, I'd say, from plastic piling and doing more with peat and wood combination. Here is an example of a bad kind of dam design, I would say. I think this was taken at a very, very dry time of the year, and I think if that was to block up any further, then water might just find its way around and start kind of flowing here. I don't know why there's round wood put in here. That might be an access thing, I'm not sure. But the key thing is keying in the sides of your dam. So when I do my training courses to contractors, you know, I'm pointing out mistakes as well. It's not always a bed of roses, but we're always learning from our mistakes and making sure that that is disseminated widely, so we understand that this is not a consistent issue across everybody. We get on top of this quickly. Here again is just another picture of a machine driving it in the plastic piling. Lots of people scratching their head around plastic piling. It takes quite a bit of thought, quite a lot of construction, quite a lot of expense to do these kind of dams. So there'll be lots of consideration how we do it. And the contractors come to us with suggestions as well. So again, it's about that two-way conversation about what's working, what needs to happen to make sure the best job is done possible. Here's a much older style dam, and this is pretty massive actually, and you can see it's actually braced with a steel kind of barrier that goes across here. Still the same principle. I like this kind of dam here. This is what we call a composite dam, and you can see again it's a big drain actually, but they've used wood here and they've filled it with peat, and there's another wood section here too. So it's basically wooden planks, and then peat and turf filled in the middle. And that was a really, really solid structure that looked good in the landscape. It was quite hard to see unless you knew what you're talking about. This was actually a national nature reserve, so probably having features like that might be helpful from an access point of view. They're good crossing points, particularly if they're well turved. So I think that looked quite successful to me. Again, that was very, very freshly dug. I think it only had a couple of months to recover, but already you can see it sort of settling in very well. Now, I do have a load of text that talks you through best practice when it comes to ditch blocking and the sort of dam spacing. I'm more than happy to make this available to you with the massive caveat that we're always reviewing our technical guidance notes, but I'm happy to share these slides with you as well, so don't feel you need to scribble them down. But what we're trying to show here, you know, what best practice, kind of specifics around dam spacing, and really kind of just kind of key tips, hints and tips really basically from what we've learned over the years doing Peatland Action and more. Points to remember are quite useful. So the big thing for us is understanding that we need to be designing for winter flow events. A lot of our, just the way the funding kind of works, and when we're out in the field, often we're surveying sites in the summer months that maybe we aren't fully appreciating winter flow events. And I think that's absolutely key for anything that's done on peatlands, be it restoration or developments or anything, is understanding what that maximum flow period might look like. Because I think some sites I've been to, we have been astonished at how much water can move through these systems. And I think that is a Scottish thing as well. So some techniques that have worked very successfully in the north of England, and maybe under drier conditions, have not worked so well up in Scotland, because just it's so wet, there's so much water. And I think we're now moving to years of where we're going to see more intense rainfall events. And so it's about understanding what those maximum water flow under those events, which may only happen 4 or 5 times a year, but could be enough to really keep the erosion from happening in these sites. Then that's a key thing to understand, is what do these sites look like in the winter under the worst conditions. Okay, I've also got these little helpful slides here that just show you the kind of key considerations when we're talking about each of our restoration techniques. So here we'd be thinking about water shedding, where we're putting in our dams, and making sure the dams themselves are really well capped and really consolidated well with a digger. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. That's us at 3:30. That seems to me a nice point to stop before we rattle through lots of other different restoration techniques. Thanks everybody for returning. Nice to see you all. We've got quite a bit more to cover. Kenny, well, if you could both just let me know when we're getting close to the final question and answer session at the end. That would be great, just to keep me on track. Okay. I want to rattle through some more of the restoration techniques, just so you've got an understanding what it is we're talking about. And as I said, hopefully just lots of images so you can understand what it means in real life. Okay, great. So ditch reprofiling, this is an extension to what we're discussing before the break, ditch blocking. So we used to really just concentrate on putting dams into ditches. Now we know you get a far better result if you reprofile that ditch as well. And if you see the bottom image here, this is a great example of a drain. So this is an artificial drain line here, and you can see this one's actually been blocked using wood. And that might be because peat's actually quite shallow in this area, and wood was a better option. But the sides of this drain have been reprofiled again. And this is again using the same technique, tamping down these edges. And you get a much shallower depression that way, which revegetates really quickly. You don't get really big, deep pools of water, which is very important if you've still got livestock on the site. So we tend to always now reprofile drains as well as block them. You just get a better result. Here again, an example of a drain that's been reprofiled and blocked. So here you have your little peat dams all the way up, and then this is the kind of reprofiling here. You can see and a shallower pool of water, which infilled in this instance very quickly with sphagnum moss. There's some other examples of how you might tackle drains, something called wave dams and zipping. Again, these are sort of terms I've seen mostly associated work with wind farm sites, where they've done a bit of sort of reinstatement and restoration of the area. And here is basically a very quick technique to block a drain. So this is a wave dam here. And you can see the drain line runs here, and basically a machine, I think, has just straddled the side of this and has scooped in the edges as they've gone, and then made sure they're turfed and well tamped down. So it's a very quick way of blocking a drain line. You don't get such well consolidated structures, so that's why you do lots of them. But the idea here is it was much quicker. They thought as well it might revegetate quicker, so infill with sphagnum as well. So there's different types of ditch blocking, and it can get a bit jargony. Different contractors, different consultants might use different terms, but if you're not sure about anything, just come back to the project designer. Here again is a zipping technique, so it's like kind of interlocking, overlapping sort of sections that are brought in. I'm doing all the moves of a digger here on screen, but you probably can't see me very well. Usually I do my digger impression at this point, but obviously we're doing this online, so hopefully this diagram helps a bit. But basically a scoop is brought in either side of the drain line, and that helps block the whole drain itself. Here's an example here. You can see, I think this is what's been called a zip site, and you can see lots of pools of water here and the kind of infill in between. So obviously that's blocked up that drain line. And if you start seeing weird features like this on Google Earth where drains look like zips, then these dotty sort of features, and that's a restoration site. And it's really nice that we can now see on Google Earth that, yeah, there's quite a lot of restoration that's happened so far in Scotland. Okay, so there we go. We've now covered our ditch blocking, and just say we're going to just go through restoration techniques until about 4:15, and at that point I think it's important to stop and we'll run through some of the questions that you've posed. Okay, now a bit about bare peat restoration. The primary aim with bare peat restoration, of course, is about stabilising bare peat, stopping it eroding and helping vegetation kind of revegetate, recolonise these bare peat areas. And again, a really simple technique in terms of how we do it is reprofiling. So we've talked about reprofiling our drains. This is reprofiling our kind of eroding peat edges. So I'd call this a peat hag here. And this is what a peat hag looks like after it's been reprofiled. So you can see turves have been manipulated from the site, usually either behind the excavator or even just from the top of the hag itself. And they have been tamped down over the peat edge. The peat edge is now a much kind of gentler angle, being returved, so you get this very quick, rapid returving and restabilising, if you like, of this bare peat edge. It's a great technique. It works really well, particularly in areas where you have lots of long, kind of linear sort of hags. It's much more difficult to do in a very, very convoluted system, but it can be a very successful technique. Again, just using the materials on site, you're just paying for digger time, staff time. Some kind of things to just watch out for here. This is a hag that's halfway through reprofiling. So here's unreprofiled, and along this slope here, it's been reprofiled. In the back, it's been reprofiled. You've got to be careful though in working in winter conditions. You don't want to be incorporating snow or ice into your hag, into your reprofiled hag, because that could just kind of create lenses of water that then thaw, defrost, flow out, and it becomes a bit of a kind of pipe, if you like, a network that water can flow through and can undermine your restoration work. So again, winter conditions can be tricky. Here again, very text heavy slides, but I'll share these with you after the event. But things really to think about when you're doing hag reprofiling is you want a really gentle slope, so nothing's going to slump or slip. Nice gentle slope. You need to be thinking how the turves connect at the top, so water doesn't just flow behind your turves on your slope. Think about water flow in the base of that gully, at the base of that hag. You don't want water flowing past and undermining the work that you've done. Thinking again, if you're going to have to borrow turves, it's about reinstatement of those borrow pits. Really, really important. We don't want to create more areas of bare peat. And really need to make sure the turves that you put down on the slopes are really, really well knitted together. And again, that's best done with an excavator. There's been examples of this done by hand where machine access wasn't possible. And it really hasn't worked terribly well. It's too blocky. You need the pressure of that machine, the kind of force of it to help knit all these turves together. And we've seen this picture before. This is a nice example, really nice example of some reprofiling using, I think that's about an 8-ton excavator, low ground pressure with a tilting bucket as well, which is excellent. And the same picture again, different machine. Again, you know, machine availability. We'll probably talk about that later. There's been a question about contractor availability. Often you've got to kind of work with machines you can get hold of. This is a site on Lewis. And it's a local guy with a local kit, and this was the size machine that he had available to do this kind of work. Again, you know, hag reprofiling probably needs to be considered in the context of slowing water flow throughout a system as well. So it's not to be done in isolation often. You need to be thinking about what that water is doing and how it's moving through and past in the areas that you're reprofiling. Again, trying to drill home how complex some of these projects can be. So for example, this is a really good way of making sure your reprofiled edges. So these were just completely bare eroding faces of peat here that have been reprofiled, but they've actually installed wooden baffles, I suppose I would call them, to make sure water is not just flowing right down the edge of them. It's pushing the water out to the middle. It's revegetated, so water can seep across this area and flow down, rather than just eroding at these bank sides. So I think that's been quite successful. Again, you can see this is, you know, pretty murky weather, pretty wet this side. Gullies, I would say the critical thing here is about not impounding water, it's about slowing the flow of water. As I said before the break, and considering winter flow events and just how much water can flow through these systems. And I note there's a question from somebody about how do you assess winter flow events? Well, it's really just, you can't be there all the time. You can't, it's very hard to miss these events, but I think it's just having in the back of your mind that flow conditions could be much worse than what they are at the point that you're surveying. And I would say where you've got a system like this, where you've got a lot of mineral kind of layers showing, you've got a lot of bare peat edges, it looks terribly dry. There's clearly water coming through there at some point. So just because there isn't water there when you survey it doesn't mean water flows through these areas. And remember, gullies are always going to be the pathway for water flow. The topography is totally changed. These channels are going to be where the water flows. So lots and lots of little interventions to slow the flow of water, really, really critical. Here's some examples of what you may want to do. Here's some peat bunds, basically like peat dams. They don't go all the way up the top of the gully here, so it's not about impounding water, it's about slowing it all down, but lots of them maybe every sort of 3 meters apart in this system here. Here we have what we call a coir log, geotextile log. This is a natural fibre roll, if you like. It's like a big sausage that you can peg in, which is really useful because this can take a lot of force to the water and again slow it down. Again, you'll be looking at lots of these down that system. What's very successful and is working very well, where it's been trialled quite extensively up in the Cairngorms, for example, are stone dams. And stone dams are great because you can dump them in a pile from a helicopter, so relatively easy to install once you manage to get the helicopter to actually fly and yeah, you've got the right weather conditions and you've got the right source stone, which might be a nearby quarry. You can dump these bags of stone kind of every 5, 7, 10 meters down these gully systems, and they'll really help slow water up. They are leaky to some extent, but they will quickly backfill with peat as well. But these have worked very well, but they are incredibly expensive because they involve helicopters, and of course there's a whole kind of carbon implications from using helicopters as well, which is a really key consideration. So we don't use that much helicopter time really on our projects. Again, I'll share these slides with you. Slow the flow, the key thing, lots of interventions rather than 1 or 2 big things that, you know, are very risky if they do fail. Lots and lots of interventions, much better. It's all about deflecting water from edges that are eroding or vulnerable to erosion, and thinking about where you locate these interventions as well. So pinch points, what you're always looking for. So if we're talking about bare peat restoration, so we can do the reprofiling, that's great. You can do that where there's lots of tars and there's good machine access. You might want to slow the flow of water, make sure water is not going to be flowing and undermining any restoration work. But you might also have to give the bare peat that's left a helping hand in terms of revegetation. So here we might use a living mulch. And a living mulch is basically material that we've cut, hopefully very close to the site, collected up in bags. Sometimes these bags might have to be flown in by helicopter, or it can be moved about the site using Hagland vehicles, for example. But really, this is about taking material from elsewhere on the site. So the living mulch is usually a combination of heather and cotton grass and the sphagnum layer as well. So all those fragments and all the seeds that you bring in will hopefully help establish vegetation on your bare peat areas. Often we're applying mulch in conjunction with liming treatment to increase the pH. Some of these bare peat sites are extremely acidic, so are just not conducive to allowing vegetation to take hold and establish. So you need to raise the pH a little bit as well. So that can be quite important. And this is used quite extensively in the Cairngorms, for example. Depth of brash, you need to have sufficient depth of brash, or living mulch, it's just not going to wash away. Often this has been applied with the geotextile netting applied over the top of it, just to keep it in situ really. So pH and liming can be important. And here, you know, this is actually just shows the number of bags that you may require on a site. You know, bare peat restoration is expensive, really resource heavy, but obviously can be hugely beneficial from carbon point of view, from habitat point of view, from water regulation point of view, water quality point of view. Bare peat, eroding bare peat is not good for anything. So sometimes it does take quite a lot of resource, and it's worth the cost sorting these areas out. When you've got kind of flatter areas, you don't have these really pronounced gullies. Again, what you probably need to be looking at is the flow of surface water. Here you can obviously see waters flowing around, starting to connect up these patches of bare peat, and you can probably see a gully kind of forming there. These are the kind of areas that I would really prioritise, because they're relatively kind of lower intervention than working in big gullies, and hopefully that could stop these sites going into that sort of phase of erosion. So here you're looking at really breaking up the water flow, and you might be thinking about buns, which can be little peat buns. So basically a bucket full of peat turfed over with a cap of turf, and placed strategically that could really slow the flow up, stop the flow between different patches of peat. So really you're thinking about how you're managing and breaking up that surface water flow. Geotextiles, you may well hear about geotextiles, and you're probably actually familiar with geotextiles in relation to other developments. You often see them on the side of motorway embankments, for example, a way of stabilising slopes, and also they can help vegetation re-establish. Here's an example of two types of geotextile that were trialled up in the Moffat Hills here. This is a geojute material here on the right, and this is a sisal material, much thicker weave, really dense material. This stuff was pretty hopeless because snow just sat on it and then ripped it off, and it all kind of floated and fell down the bottom of the site. Really not very useful. But this open weave stuff, we've realised is actually very good because it creates tiny little microenvironments that stay wet, allow things like sphagnum to come through and cotton grasses, so it can actually kind of colonise relatively quickly. The problem here, you know, this is expensive stuff. You need to pre-order it. May have kind of long lead-in times. So there are considerations here, but that can be used as part of our kind of arsenal to really support revegetation of our bare peat sites. So location stability really key. How you peg this stuff in is important. Often metal pegs don't really work because frost heave seems to just pop them out, but wooden stakes seem to be much better. You need to consider herbivores. You know, if you encourage too much grassy growth, you may attract in things like hares, stuff like that, and deer as well. You might want to also consider the initial kind of entanglement issue. We've never had a situation where we've had any animals get tangled up in this stuff. This actually rots down relatively quickly and becomes, you can break it open really quite easily, which in itself might be a problem, might not be in situ long enough to really help the establishment of some sites. It's worth bearing in mind, obviously, we can be working in very high altitude sites, so our growing season is really short. So time is really important for some of our sites. Just giving them the time to recover after we've done the restoration work might be very important. We're also really concerned if we are encouraging sort of cutting of mulch or a living mulch. You know, we have a lot of guidance on how we want that done, how we don't want to be creating a problem area elsewhere because we've cut, you know, the vegetation off. So we have lots of guidance around that. Again, I can share that with you. But we try and think of everything. Okay, we'll save questions for the end. I just want to go through now probably some of the more invasive techniques that we'll consider. Usually these are associated with lowland raised bogs and afforested sites, so our forested bog sites. We talked really early on, I showed you that image of the lowland raised bog. That's an area of bog in a sea of quite intensive agriculture. What we had to do there is make sure the water stayed on the bog because there were drains on the edges that we couldn't be blocking up because they were shared with the neighbour, with the neighbouring landowner. So it's very much about keeping that lowland raised bog wet, keeping the water where it should be on the bog. There will be natural shedding of water off the bog, but we really want to really reduce the amount that's lost because of the artificial drains and the peat pipes and the cracking because the bog was very dry. So we use in that instance a technique called trench funding. And this is basically where we start to really dig quite deep into the peat, and we could be working, you know, sort of 2 meters depth of peat here. What we're doing is we're really creating an internal peat dam. So we're just using peat. We're tamping down really good consolidated peat to create that barrier. So water that might be like flowing through the peat body itself or through peat pipes is stopped, it's impeded. So you're holding that water back. We might cap it off with a surface bund, and this will be a bund of peat but capped over with turf, and that might hold back some surface water as well. But really the primary aim here is to stop water flow, usually because of loads of peat pipes. There's lots of different types of bunding, different terminology, again used by different people, but I think the key thing to really think about is your surface bund here, your trench bund here. Sometimes you might just get a trench bund, sometimes you might just get a surface bund if all you're concerned about is surface water. So for example, on a bare peat area, you might just be wanting to slow the flow of surface water or stopping the flow of surface water. But in a low and bog with lots of peat pipes, this bunding may be necessary. This is what it looks like in real life. This, I suppose you could call fish scale bunding, because it's that sort of fish scale pattern. The key thing is here you have lots of different cells, so you don't just have one big massive bund that goes all around the edge that could be very prone to failure. What you're trying to do is to have lots of cells, so if there was a breach, only one small area would be impacted, but you're reducing the amount of water being held back by any one feature in any one area. And I should say that this kind of technique is really, really carefully considered with our peat slide risk assessment. This is the technique that's been flagged up by our external consultant that looked at peat slide risk assessing, and he thought this was a key, one of the key techniques to consider. So this technique is not undertaken lightly. There's a lot of thought going into it, and there's a lot of things that we do to make sure we reduce the risk of any sort of mass movement of peat. Here, I much prefer this kind of bunding where you've actually got a very low surface bund, but still quite an important trench bund. And here it's, yes, it's holding back water, but internally rather than big pools of water. And you don't have this big sort of odd looking sort of feature left either. But again, that's the same sort of technique being used. And obviously scrub removal will be key, but often we're doing that in conjunction with hydrological intervention to suppress long-term regeneration of that scrub going forward. Mulching and brashing, we've talked a bit about that. We should probably talk a little bit about mulching. There have been some sites where whole trees were mulched in situ. This was a failed conifer plantation, and it wasn't economically viable to remove that crop. So they've done whole stem mulching and left the mulch in situ. This is not a technique that we would do unless we absolutely had to. This is last resort. Really, we want to get as much material off as possible so we have an open site we can work with. Now, finally, this brings me on to forest to bog restoration techniques. And hopefully you remember I showed you that sort of infographic that talked a bit about the level of disturbance and intervention that was required. And that related back to the amount of level of disturbance initially to kind of change that site into something else. Where we have to really often think about throwing the kitchen sink at it is when we're trying to take a site that's had a commercial conifer crop on it, revert it back to open bog habitat. This is when we need to be doing quite invasive techniques. We do something called ground smoothing, and ground smoothing really refers back to the topography that's created because of all the drain lines and all the plough and furrow lines. Really, you need a flat surface to have a good bog and to have more even sort of re-wetting. So here's a great example. You can see the level of ridges and furrows. Yes, you've got drains cut here. You've got drains actually leading to quite a bit of active erosion. But yeah, you've got this ridge and furrow topography. So ground smoothing is exactly as it sounds. It's about taking a machine and doing techniques that will smooth out that surface. And that might even just be as simple as tracking a machine over an area just to push down those ridges. It might only be a few centimetres high by that point. However, you get sites that have been very deeply ploughed that may need more intervention, and that might be stump flipping. So this is when you actually manipulate the existing tree stumps that are still in situ. So the timber's been harvested, but the stump is still there. And you actually flip that stump over into the furrow, and then you track over it with your machine and tamp it in. So you end up with a very flat surface, and it sounds truly awful, but here's a site that was ground smoothed, a site that was clear filled. This is deep peat, up to about 6 metres of peat. It's a Fortune Land Scotland site that they managed really well. It was a great restoration project. You can see they've done as much brash recovery as they possibly can, so it's a good, relatively clean site to work, and that's useful for contractors. They can see the stump line is, they can see where the drains are. It's very easy to see what you're working with. And they ground smoothed it using stump flipping, and that's where they manipulated these stumps, put them into the furrows, tracked over them, and then they actually had a second machine that came in and tracked over again, just to really help compress everything into the surface. And that site turned into this about 18 months later. Actually less than 18 months later. It was one kind of full growing season that site had, and already it's got the right sort of bog vegetation coming back. So although some of these sites, some of these restoration techniques sound truly horrible, actually they are necessary, they are carefully considered, and we know that they do work. And we're using this site quite a lot in Dumfries and Galloway because we've trialled it at a couple of sites, and we know that it's worked in those situations. So this is the technique that we're using. But again, lots of considerations, everything that we've talked about, from kind of impact on watercourses. So here we had a 20-metre buffer between the ground smoothed area, stump flipped area, and the adjacent watercourse. So we're trying not to manipulate and damage ground too close to a watercourse. Again, you know, forest and water guidelines are very useful for us. And just some more examples of the same sort of techniques in ground smoothing. So again, just to flag up, you know, this is complex stuff. We're learning as we go. We talk to as many people as we can about it, and we try and learn from what we do. But you know, we're getting pretty good at it. We've worked on over 25,000 hectares now in Scotland, and there's a huge wealth of knowledge out there. And yeah, hopefully that will give you some reassurance that we're always trying to do the best thing.